First, let's define race. Race is a social category constructed around physical characteristics that we as a society deem important. Eye color is not an important physical characteristic around which our society has defined social groups. Other physical features, such as skin color, are. Individuals socially construct and perpetuate racial categories. An important concept that often gets confused with race is ethnicity. Ethnicity is a social category based on shared cultural characteristics, such as place of origin, dress, food, and religion. Race is not biologically defined. There is no specific gene or combination of genes that clearly identifies a given race. However, it is important to remember that though race is not real in a biological sense, it is real in its social consequences. Race is a category with a great deal of social meaning and consequences in our society, and shapes the lives of individuals. There's a very real disparity in wealth inequality by race, as we can see from the previous graph. Race is real because of the social meanings we attach to it, and it shapes our life chances. Recall the link to the news story regarding the Hodgson sisters in your reading folder this week, and think about how different life experiences these sisters will have. A minority group refers to a group of people who have less power than the dominant group and are subject to unequal treatment. Note, they may be of the numerical majority. In the U.S., racial and ethnic minorities have a greater risk of living in poverty and face prejudice as well as personal and institutional discrimination in their lives. Prejudice is a negative attitude toward an entire category of people. Discrimination is the denial of opportunities and equal rights to people on an arbitrary bias. Prejudice refers to people's attitudes about others. Discrimination refers to their behaviors toward others. Institutional racism is the denial of opportunities and equal rights to racial minorities that results from the normal operations of a society. This occurs when an institution uses a seemingly race-neutral practice that has an adverse effect on a specific racial group. One example is legacy admissions at universities. Some colleges and universities provide a boost to a student's college application if a family member graduated from that school. Though this policy has nothing to do with race directly, at one point in U.S. history, only whites were allowed in colleges and universities. Because of this fact, whites are much more likely than racial minorities to have a family member that graduated from college and therefore to benefit from this rule. Other examples are homeownership tax credits and voting ID requirements. Institutional racism is not the only thing perpetuating racial inequality. Often, discrimination occurs due to unconscious prejudice. One of your readings by Meyer demonstrates how unconscious racial bias by law partners can lead to a systematic disadvantage to minorities within the workplace. Similarly, a study was done by Bertrand, 2003, demonstrating that discrimination in hiring exists as well. Identical resumes were sent to over 1,300 different types of jobs. The only differences in the resumes were the names of the fake applicants. African American sounding names, such as Lakeisha Washington or Jamal Jones, were used for some applications, and white-sounding names, such as Emily Walsh and Brendan Baker, were used for others. Resumes with white-sounding names received 50% more calls for interviews than resumes with black-sounding names. These different forms of racism contribute to the perpetuation of wealth inequality by racial category. In the U.S., our culture values meritocracy, which argues that all citizens are equal and should have the same opportunities to succeed. It follows that racial inequality is a social problem in the U.S. Some measures have been taken to change this problem. Affirmative action is a set of policies designed to increase opportunities for historically disadvantaged groups. It's based on the assumption that in the absence of racism, institutional or otherwise, The position of whites and people of color would reflect the population. For example, if whites make up 72% of the U.S. population, they should also make up about the same percentage of managers, college students, politicians, etc. If whites are promoted in law firms over blacks or given more job interviews for no other reason than their race, this is an unearned advantage that creates an overrepresentation of whites in high-earning positions and positions of power. Affirmative action seeks to shrink or reduce unearned white advantage, or to level the playing field in work and educational organizations. Racial inequality in social institutions is improving, whereby organizational demographics are becoming closer to the racial breakdown of the country as a whole. There has been an increase in college enrollment of racial minorities in recent decades. Also, the 133rd Congress, the current Congress, is the most racially diverse Congress in U.S. history. Refer back to the link in your reading folder for more information on the 133rd Congress. The final form of inequality discussed in this lecture is gender inequality. Sociologists argue that society is created and continuously reproduced by the shared meanings of individuals through interactions. This is true for gender as a social category as well. Gender is the social attribution of meaning to the categories of men and women. Gender is often the source of meaning in interaction. In other words, how we interpret an individual's behavior is different for the same behavior depending on their perceived gender. Gender is also structural in that it is used to organize society. We learn which meanings and behaviors are associated with gender through the process of gender socialization. The socialization of certain gendered meanings and behaviors often makes them feel natural to us. Many sociologists argue that gender is something that is performed. It is something that one does rather than something that one is. For example, we may describe someone's gender as not aligning with their behavior. For example, when someone says she acts like a boy about a young girl, or tries to encourage a boy to be brave by saying something like, "Stop being such a girl and do it." Recall the web link to the cartoon in your reading folder. The cartoon demonstrates that people perform gender not only through the clothes they wear, but also through their body language. Men who have been socialized to position their bodies in masculine ways, such as spreading their legs when they sit, may come to do so without even realizing they're doing it. Sexism is the unequal treatment and evaluation of men and women, specifically the attribution of positive characteristics, privileges, and opportunities to men at the expense of women. This includes both attitudes, prejudice, and practices, discrimination. Often in our society, there is a devaluation of femininity. For example, girls that identify as tomboy are often given higher status in peer groups, while boys that act feminine are given lower status in peer groups. Sexism leads to structural gender inequality in employment. Female-dominated industries, hairdressers, preschool teachers, dental assistants, tend to earn much lower salaries than male-dominated industries, engineers, professors, dentists. In the U.S., there is a devaluation of care work, which refers to work that involves caring for others, in general, which tends to be female-dominated. Additionally, when other variables are controlled for, women earn about 81 cents for every dollar earned by a man doing the same job. Though women make up more than half the U.S. population and nearly half of the working population, they only make up about 15% of executive management and corporate board positions at Fortune 500 companies.